Hello, Telvanni here, and I just wanted to do a bit of a follow-up to my Lightning Conduit video for Path of Exile 3.24 Necropolis. In that last video, we looked at a potential theoretical and untested League start idea for mana stacking on Elementalist. And again, I'd like to stress here that we're just playing around with some concepts and ideas. It's not possible to playtest the build until the patch drops, so it's not necessarily a safe pick if you're looking for a tried and tested League starter. With that bit of a disclaimer out of the way, let's get into the video. As promised, I've looked into some potential ideas for League starting a non-Archmage version of Lightning Conduit Elementalist. Just on the slim chance Archmage Support doesn't work the way we are assuming it does. You can check out my Archmage video for more details on that. Quick segue here. I was in the middle of editing this video when I received an email response from GGG regarding Archmage Support. Chris Wilson has confirmed that the added mana cost is applied early on for calculations. The intent is that you can reduce the mana cost through various mechanics that do so, such as Inspiration Support or the Hierophant notable passive. This is absolutely huge news for all mana stacking builds, as it should in theory allow the incurred cost from running Archmage to be quite manageable, even in a League start scenario. I've still decided to release this video going over some of the differences between an Archmage Lightning Conduit build and a non-Archmage Lightning Conduit build, because I think it covers some really important information, especially for anyone considering starting Lightning Conduit this league. And I also know not everyone is interested in running a mana stacker. Alright, let's get back into the video. From my PoE warrioring, it seems like a non-mana stacking version of the build is going to have significantly less maximum damage potential than an Archmage build. You can see here that this hypothetical path of building I've thrown together puts us at 3.2 million damage on an early League start setup, a far cry from the 6 million that we're estimating with the Archmage version. However, the surprising thing here is that because we're not running Arcane Cloak or Sigil of Power, when we deactivate our main buffs, the things that aren't going to be up 100% of the time, especially while running through maps, we're still pretty close in terms of damage to the Archmage variant, with the Archmage version of the build coming in at around 1.9 million mapping DPS, versus this version's 1.7 million mapping DPS. So you're not necessarily going to be seeing a really big difference while mapping, apart from the occasional tanky rare or a map boss. All in all, this non-Archmage version of the build looks, on paper anyway, pretty solid for a League start character. Alright, so let's talk about some of the differences between going Archmage versus a more traditional route for Lightning Conduit. And let me be clear here. Both versions of the build are probably going to be pretty squishy. It's softcore. This is just kind of the nature of League starters for us. This is not to say that either of the builds are going to be significantly squishier than most other League starters. Something like Lightning Arrow, for example, is probably going to be dying more often than either of these builds at League start. And while there are some potential things we could do to shore up our defenses early on, this would cost us quite a bit of damage. Zizarin usually has some really good, in-depth, full build guides for builds with more of a hardcore focus, but as a softcore player, I'm not going to be building in that direction at League launch anyway. This leads us to another point I'd like to bring up, and as far as I can tell, Lightning Conduit Elementalist, regardless of Archmage versus non-Archmage, is always going to be somewhat on the squishier side of things. The mana stacking Archmage version's main defensive layers, and pretty much its only defensive layers, are Mind Over Matter and Arcane Cloak, the latter of which, like any guard's skill, isn't going to be up 100% of the time. We also get a little bit of Energy Shield, but at the end of the day, we're mostly just a meat shield, with large pools of life, mana, and energy shield, since we're not really building into armor, evasion, or spell suppression early on. As an Archmage Mind Over Matter build, we also can't grab things very easily like Grace or Determination, some of the traditional go-tos for layered defense, and even if we obtain a Mage Blood with some Granite and Jade flasks for armor and evasion, we're still mostly in the top side of the tree. So that armor and evasion is going to be pretty weak, since we don't have a lot of access to increased armor and evasion passives. We do get some access to Energy Shield passives, but Energy Shield isn't generally that great, and doesn't really start to shine until you start heavily investing in it. which is something we don't really have the option to do here. Taking a look at the other side of things, the more traditional version of the build with a non-Archmage setup is going to have more access to things like armor, evasion, and spell suppression, as it doesn't have to hard focus mana nodes all over the tree, allowing it to meander down into the right side of the passive tree. And since it's not worried about reserving mana, it can grab those auras we talked about earlier, like Determination and Grace. Something I should note here is that for most regular versions of the build, ones not mana stacking, you're probably going to be taking Eldritch Battery to sustain mana costs. This is something that's just not possible to do on Archmage builds, but regular versions can convert their Energy Shield into basically an infinite mana pool, with the trade-off that Energy Shield no longer protects our health. Additionally, regardless of what route you choose, at the end of the day, these versions of Lightning Conduit are self-cast builds. So in order to deal sustained damage, we need to be standing still, which opens us up to missing a Flame Dash and potentially getting slammed by a boss. Having examined a little bit of both versions' defenses, let's take a look at damage and offense. Like I said earlier, I believe mana stacking Archmage builds are going to have a higher single target damage early on, but both builds should be fairly comparable in terms of mapping potential at League start. Mid to late game, I think a non-mana stacking build is probably going to be able to catch up in terms of damage, with the ability to squeeze in more auras like Wrath, Haste, and Zealotry, especially after they get access to things like Enlightened Support, Essence-crafted Helms, and Eldritch Implicits. Also, because regular versions aren't as heavily invested into mana nodes all over the place, they have the potential to more easily transition to a crit version of the build, which could increase the damage even further. This is not to say that Archmage builds would deal less damage than a traditional version of the build, just that they probably would be pretty comparable. You could potentially do something with Indigon on a mana stacker. However, I've never really been a huge fan of Indigon builds, as they've always felt pretty clunky to play. So that's probably not something I'm likely to explore, although by all means, look into something like that for yourself. It certainly has the potential to be very powerful, and at the end of the day, I'm just trying to inform and share some of my thoughts and ideas with you, the community. Finally, I'd like to say that I think both versions of this build, at higher investment, could really benefit from things like Mage Blood, obviously, but even before that, I'd probably look at building into the Annihilating Light. The triple damage with elemental skills is just incredibly powerful. However, I do think Annihilating Light will be easier to work around on a non-Archmage version of the build, as Purity of Elements would really help immensely to overcome the reduced elemental resistances from the staff. This is something that just isn't really viable for mana stackers, as they really want to avoid reserving any of their precious mana. Anyway, I hope you found this video helpful. I've had a lot of thoughts floating around my head about Lightning Conduit, Archmage, and mana stackers the past couple of days, and I just wanted to get some of them out and share them with you. I know it's cheesy to say, but genuinely, please do comment if you think you've got something constructive to add to the discussion. If you think I've missed something, or you had a stroke of inspiration while watching this, I'd like to know. I do genuinely try to read all of the comments on my newer videos, even if I don't necessarily respond to all of them. And over the past few days, it's been incredibly helpful discussing some of the upcoming changes with you, the viewers, in the comments section. So to wrap things up, thank you for watching, good luck with your league, and I'll see you in the next one.